When we think about vulnerability, it's easy to associate it with weakness. We might imagine someone being overly emotional, exposed, or unguarded, but vulnerability isn't about being fragile. In fact, it's the opposite. Vulnerability is one of the most courageous acts we can engage in because it requires us to drop our defenses and allow ourselves to be seen, truly seen, without guarantees of how others will respond. Now, when we talk about not telling people what we do, that's a form of vulnerability. It may not seem like it at first glance, but think about it. When we meet someone new, or even when we're reconnecting with old friends, one of the first things we tend to lead with is what we do for work. It's the safe, familiar thing. I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher, I work in finance. But why do we do this? It's because when we tell people what we do, we're giving them something that feels tangible, something they can quickly grasp and judge us by. And when we give people that, we feel a little more in control of how they perceive us. But here's where vulnerability comes into play. When we withhold that label, when we resist the urge to define ourselves by our job or our accomplishments, we're stepping into a much more uncertain and exposed space. We're saying, I'm going to let you see me as I am, without any of the armor, and that's scary because it means we're opening ourselves up to the possibility of being misunderstood, or worse, not being seen at all. Vulnerability in this context is about showing up without the safety net of titles and roles. It's about trusting that who we are, beyond what we do, is enough. And that's hard. It's hard because society has conditioned us to believe that our worth is tied to our productivity, to our success, to the roles we play in our professional lives. From a young age, we're asked what we want to be when we grow up. And while the question seems innocent enough, the subtext is clear: your value is tied to what you do, to the title you'll eventually hold. So when we make the choice to not tell people what we do, we're challenging that narrative. We're saying, my value is inherent. It's not something that can be summed up in a job title, but to make that statement, to really live that truth, requires vulnerability. It requires us to believe that who we are, in all of our complexities and imperfections, is worth knowing regardless of what's on our business cards. And here's the thing about vulnerability: it's contagious. When we have the courage to show up without our titles, it invites others to do the same. It creates space for more honest, more authentic connections. When we lead with vulnerability, we give permission to those around us to drop their own defenses, to stop hiding behind their roles and achievements, and to engage with us on a deeper, more meaningful level. But vulnerability isn't just about inviting others in. It's also about being willing to sit with the discomfort that comes with not relying on the external validation we get from sharing what we do. Because let's face it, telling people about our job often gives us a hit of affirmation. It feels good to be recognized for what we've accomplished. It feels good when someone says, wow, that's impressive. But if we're constantly seeking that validation from outside of ourselves, we're never really standing in our own power. We're giving away control of our self-worth to the opinions of others. Vulnerability is about reclaiming that power. It's about trusting that who we are is enough, even when we're not performing, even when we're not achieving, even when we're not impressing anyone. It's about believing that our value isn't something that can be measured by a paycheck, a title, or a degree. And that's hard. It's especially hard in a world that's constantly telling us to hustle, to achieve more, to do more. But when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, when we stop telling people what we do and start showing up as who we are, we're making a powerful statement. We're saying, I am enough just as I am, without the labels, without the accolades, without the achievements. Vulnerability is also about embracing uncertainty. When we meet someone and choose not to define ourselves by what we do, we're stepping into a space of the unknown. We don't know how they'll react. We don't know if they'll still be interested in us or if they'll lose interest when they can't immediately categorize us. And that's scary. It's scary because as humans, we crave certainty. We want to know where we stand with people, and we want to feel like we have some control over how they perceive us. But the truth is, real connection isn't about control. It's about letting go. It's about allowing ourselves to be seen in all of our messiness and all of our uncertainty. It's about showing up without the need to impress or perform, and trusting that the right people will see us and appreciate us for who we are, not for what we do. In this way, vulnerability becomes a source of strength. It takes an immense amount of courage to show up without the protection of a title or a role. It takes bravery to allow ourselves to be seen as we are, without the need for external validation. But when we do, we open the door to deeper, more meaningful relationships. We create space for authenticity, for real connection, and for growth. From the moment we enter school, and perhaps even earlier, we're conditioned to think about what we want to be when we grow up. It's one of the first questions adults ask children: what do you want to be? As if the future success of a person can be encapsulated in a single, neat job title. The question might seem harmless, but it plants a seed. It teaches us that our identity is tied to a title, to a label that society can easily digest and categorize. As we get older, the pressure intensifies. In high school, we start thinking about college, trade school, or some career path, and every decision feels like a building block toward a future defined by what we will do. We choose majors, degrees, certifications, all in service of attaining that coveted title: doctor, engineer, lawyer, teacher, artist. Entrepreneur. We attach our sense of self-worth to this imagined future, believing that once we achieve that role, then and only then will we truly matter. But what happens when we finally get there? What happens when we achieve the title we've been chasing for years, sometimes decades? There's a momentary satisfaction, sure, a sense of validation. But it doesn't take long before that feeling fades and we find ourselves looking for the next title, the next achievement, the next rung on the ladder. The truth is, if we base our self-worth on the titles we hold, we will always be chasing, always looking for the next way to prove our value. The problem with tying our identity to a title is that titles are fragile. They can be taken away. Jobs change, careers shift, companies downsize, entire industries can become obsolete. If our worth is tied to a job title, what happens to us when that title no longer exists? When we lose the position or the company folds or we retire, who are we then? But this isn't just about losing titles. It's also about the fact that titles never tell the whole story of who we are. Titles are too small, too narrow to encompass the richness of a person's experience, the depth of their humanity. If I tell you I'm a lawyer, you might have a sense of what I do, but you don't know anything about who I am. You don't know what drives me, what keeps me up at night, what I'm passionate about beyond my work. The title gives you one dimension, but we are multidimensional beings. We are so much more than the roles we play. We are complex, evolving, and ever-changing. Yet we live in a culture that constantly tells us to measure ourselves by what we do, by what we accomplish, by how much we can produce. The language we use reflects this obsession. We ask each other, "What do you do?" instead of "Who are you?" We praise people for their promotions, for climbing the corporate ladder, for their outward signs of success. But rarely do we take the time to see the person behind the title. This attachment to titles can be especially damaging when we use them to compare ourselves to others. It's easy to look at someone else's title and feel less than maybe you're at a dinner party, and someone introduces themselves as a CEO or partner at a law firm, and suddenly you feel small. You feel like your title doesn't measure up. But here's the thing, comparing titles is a game we will never win, because no title is ever enough. If we're always looking at others and judging ourselves by their job descriptions, we'll forever feel inadequate. The game is rigged because titles are arbitrary, they don't define our worth. There's another layer to this too. Sometimes we get so caught up in achieving a certain title that we lose sight of the things that really matter to us. We spend years working toward a position or a role only to realize once we get there that it doesn't bring us the fulfillment we expected. Maybe we thought that becoming a manager or landing that dream job would make us feel successful, make us feel whole. But when we arrive, we're left with a hollow feeling, a sense that something is still missing. That's because self-worth doesn't come from external labels. It doesn't come from the corner office, the title on the business card, or the accolades from others. Self-worth comes from within. It comes from knowing deep down that we are valuable simply because we exist, simply because we are here. Our worth is intrinsic. It's not something that can be earned or achieved. It's something we already have, something we've always had, regardless of what we do for work. And yet, the world tells us otherwise. The world tells us that our value is tied to our productivity, to how much we can accomplish, to the roles we play in society. This is especially true in cultures that prize individual achievement. We celebrate the self-made man or woman, the person who pulls themselves up by their bootstraps and achieves something great. But this narrative is dangerous because it suggests that those who don't achieve greatness, who don't hold prestigious titles, are somehow less valuable, less worthy. We see this play out in so many ways. Think about how we treat people based on their jobs. A CEO or a doctor walks into a room and there's an automatic sense of respect, admiration, even reverence. But what about the person cleaning the room or serving the food? How often do we overlook the inherent dignity of those jobs simply because they don't come with fancy titles? We've been conditioned to equate certain jobs with more worth, but this is a false equation. Every person, regardless of their role, has value. Every person contributes something meaningful to the world, whether or not their job is considered prestigious. The truth is, we don't need a title to be worthy. We don't need a job to validate our existence. Our worth is not something that can be measured by the number of degrees we hold, the size of our paycheck, or the prestige of our profession. It's something that comes from within, from the simple fact that we are human, that we are alive, that we are alive, that we are capable of love, kindness, and connection. But stepping away from titles requires a shift in mindset. It requires us to unlearn the messages we've been taught about where our worth comes from. It requires us to let go of the need for external validation and to cultivate a sense of self-worth that isn't dependent on what we do, but on who we are. This isn't easy, especially in a world that is constantly telling us to do more, achieve more, be more. But it's necessary if we want to live authentically, if we want to truly connect with ourselves and others. When we stop defining ourselves by our titles, we open ourselves up to a deeper understanding of who we are. We begin to see that our worth is not something that can be given or taken away by a job. It's something that is inherent, something that has always been there, waiting for us to recognize it. Seeking validation is one of the most deeply ingrained habits we have as human beings. It's natural to want approval from others, to feel recognized, appreciated, and valued. From the time we're children, we are conditioned to seek this validation. We are praised for good grades, rewarded for good behavior, and celebrated for accomplishments. In many ways, our sense of self-worth becomes intertwined with how others perceive us, and this cycle of seeking external validation can follow us into adulthood. But here's the thing: living for external validation is a trap. It's an endless pursuit that never truly satisfies because at its core, it's built on the idea that our worth is something outside of us, something that needs to be earned, granted, or approved by others. When we seek validation from external sources, we are giving away our power. We allow others to dictate how we feel about ourselves, and we lose touch with the only validation that truly matters, the one that comes from within. Breaking free from the need for external validation takes an immense amount of courage. It requires us to stand firm in who we are, even when the world around us is telling us to seek approval. It means stepping away from the constant feedback loop of likes, praise, and accolades and trusting that we are enough, regardless of what anyone else thinks. But this isn't easy. In fact, it can be one of the most challenging things we do, especially in a society that is built on performance and comparison. Everywhere we look, we are bombarded with messages about how we should look, how we should act, and what we should achieve. Social media, in particular, amplifies this pressure. We scroll through carefully curated images of other people's lives, measuring ourselves against a highlight reel that only shows the successes, the beauty, and the accomplishments. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, if I just achieve what they have, I'll be worthy. If I just get that promotion, lose that weight, or land that deal, then I'll be enough. But the truth is, even when we reach those milestones, the sense of validation is fleeting. It feels good for a moment, sure, but soon enough, we find ourselves craving more. The bar keeps moving, the goalposts shift, and we're left chasing the next hit of approval. The pursuit of external validation becomes like an addiction, no matter how much we get. It's never enough to fill the void. So, what does it mean to have the courage not to seek external validation? It means being willing to face the discomfort of not being liked, not being praised, not being the center of attention. It means embracing the idea that we cannot control how others see us or what they think of us, and that's okay. It means developing a sense of self-worth that is not contingent on applause or recognition, but comes from a deep understanding of our inherent value. Choosing not to seek external validation is an act of rebellion in a world that is constantly telling us to conform, to please others, to perform. It's about rejecting the notion that our worth is something that can be measured by external metrics. And that takes bravery because it often means going against the grain, standing apart from the crowd, and being okay with not fitting into the mold that society has created for us. This kind of courage is not about arrogance or pretending that we don't care what anyone thinks. It's about recognizing that while we may care, because we're human, and it's natural to want to belong, we don't need to base our entire sense of self on other people's opinions. It's about finding a balance between caring for others and their perspectives while maintaining our own internal compass, our own sense of who we are and what matters to us. One of the most challenging aspects of not seeking external validation is the realization that not everyone will like us. This can be a hard truth to accept, especially for those of us who have spent much of our lives trying to be people pleasers, trying to make everyone happy. But the reality is that no matter what we do, no matter how hard we try, we will never be able to please everyone. Someone will always have an opinion, a judgment, or a critique, and if we allow those external voices to dictate our self-worth, we will be forever at their mercy. True courage comes from understanding that our value is not dependent on being liked or accepted by everyone. It comes from the willingness to disappoint people if it means staying true to ourselves. This can be particularly difficult in environments where we are expected to conform to certain norms, whether in our careers, social circles, or even family dynamics. Sometimes the very act of being authentic means risking the disapproval of those around us, and that takes an extraordinary amount of bravery. Not seeking external validation also means letting go of the need for constant reassurance. We've all had moments where we look to others to tell us we're on the right track, that we're doing a good job, that we're worthy. And while feedback can be valuable, there's a difference between accepting feedback and relying on it to determine our self-worth. When we stop seeking validation from others, we begin to trust our own inner voice. We learn to listen to our intuition, to trust our instincts, and to follow our own path, even if it doesn't align with what others expect from us. This shift from external to internal validation is a profound one. It allows us to move through life with a greater sense of freedom because we're no longer tied to the opinions of others. We're no longer performing for an audience, trying to win approval, or seeking affirmation. Instead, we're living in alignment with our own values, our own beliefs, and our own truth. But it's important to recognize that this isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily practice. Every day, we are faced with opportunities to seek external validation, whether it's through social media, in our workplace, or in our relationships. The courage to not seek validation is something we must cultivate consistently, moment by moment. It's about catching ourselves when we start to perform for others, when we start to seek that approval, and gently reminding ourselves that we don't need it, that we are enough just as we are. Choosing not to seek external validation also means redefining success on our own terms. For so long, we've been taught that success looks a certain way, whether it's climbing the corporate ladder, achieving a certain level of fame, or acquiring material wealth. But when we stop looking for external validation, we begin to see that success isn't about meeting society's expectations. It's about living a life that feels true to us, that aligns with our values, our passions, and our purpose. This kind of success may not always be visible to others. It may not come with a trophy, a promotion, or public recognition. But it's the kind of success that brings deep fulfillment because it's rooted in authenticity. It's the kind of success that doesn't depend on applause, but on the quiet satisfaction of knowing we are living in integrity with ourselves. There's also a deep sense of peace that comes with no longer seeking external validation. When we are constantly looking to others for approval, we live in a state of anxiety, always wondering if we're measuring up, if we're doing enough, if we're being enough, if we're being enough. But when we stop seeking validation, that anxiety begins to fade. We begin to realize that we don't need to perform, we don't need to hustle for our worth, we can just be. And that sense of peace, that freedom from the constant need for approval, is one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves. Of course, this doesn't mean we'll never feel the pull to seek validation again. It's a deeply ingrained habit, and it's natural to want recognition for our efforts. But the difference is that when we have the courage not to seek external validation, we don't depend on it. We don't need it to feel whole. We can appreciate it when it comes, but we are no longer defined by it. We are no longer enslaved to the opinions of others. Growth real, transformative growth requires space. It requires an environment where we are free to explore, experiment, and even fail without fear of judgment or shame. But in our fast-paced, hyper-connected world, protecting that space for growth is often easier said than done. We live in a time where there is constant pressure to perform, to be productive, and to achieve visible success. The noise of external expectations can be deafening, making it difficult to hear our own inner voice, to carve out time for self-reflection, and to honor the slow, often messy process of personal development. At its core, growth is an inherently vulnerable act. It requires us to step into the unknown, to let go of certainty, and to open ourselves up to change. But for that to happen, we need space, not just physical space, but emotional and mental space as well. We need the room to make mistakes, to learn from those mistakes, and to try again. We need the freedom to explore new ideas, to challenge old beliefs, and to stretch ourselves beyond the limits of our comfort zones. But protecting this space in a world that values constant output over quiet introspection is one of the most difficult challenges we face. One of the first steps in protecting the space for growth is learning to say no. For many of us, saying no feels counterintuitive. We've been taught to be agreeable, to take on every opportunity, to always be available, and to keep ourselves busy. But constantly saying yes to everything leaves little room for growth. When we are overcommitted, when our calendars are packed, when we are constantly running from one obligation to the next, we don't have the time or energy to engage in the kind of deep work that personal growth requires. Growth demands more than just surface-level engagement. It demands our attention, our focus, and our presence. But saying no is hard. It can feel like we're letting people down or missing out on important opportunities. We fear being perceived as selfish, unambitious, or lazy. Yet it's important to understand that saying no to certain things is not about rejecting opportunities, it's about making space for the right opportunities, the ones that align with our values, our passions, and our long-term growth. Protecting the space for growth means being intentional with how we use our time and energy. It means setting boundaries not just with others, but with ourselves, and prioritizing what truly matters over what feels urgent in the moment. Another aspect of protecting the space for growth is cultivating solitude. In a world that is constantly on where notifications and distractions are just a click away, finding time to be alone with our thoughts is increasingly rare. Yet solitude is essential for growth. It's in the quiet moments when we are free from the influence of others that we can truly connect with ourselves. It's in solitude that we gain clarity about what we want, who we are, and where we are headed. Solitude allows us to hear the quiet, inner whispers of our intuition that are often drowned out by the noise of the external world. But solitude, like saying no, can feel uncomfortable. Many of us are used to filling every moment with activity, with social interaction, or with digital distractions. We equate busyness with productivity, and we fear that if we slow down, we'll fall behind. But growth doesn't happen in the busyness. It happens in the stillness, in the moments of reflection, in the time we carve out for ourselves to be present with our thoughts and feelings. Protecting the space for growth means embracing solitude as a necessary part of the process. It means giving ourselves permission to step away from the noise, to unplug, and to sit with the discomfort of being alone with ourselves. In protecting the space for growth, we also need to protect ourselves from the pressures of comparison. Comparison is one of the biggest obstacles to growth because it shifts our focus from our own journey to someone else's. It's so easy to look around and see what others are doing, to measure ourselves against their achievements, and to feel like we're falling behind. But growth is not a race. It's not about how quickly we can get from point A to point B. It's about the depth of the transformation, the lessons we learn along the way, and the person we become through the process. Comparison robs us of the ability to appreciate our own growth. It makes us doubt ourselves, question our progress, and feel inadequate, even when we are exactly where we need to be. Protecting the space for growth means recognizing that our path is our own and it doesn't have to look like anyone else's. It means honoring our unique journey and trusting that growth happens at its own pace, sometimes quickly, but more often slowly, quietly, and in ways that are not immediately visible to others. Part of protecting the space for growth also involves creating an environment that supports it. This includes surrounding ourselves with people who encourage our growth rather than hinder it. Growth can be a vulnerable process, and if we are constantly surrounded by people who criticize, judge, or belittle our efforts, it becomes much harder to move forward. The people we surround ourselves with can either nurture our growth or stifle it. It's important to seek out relationships that provide support, encouragement, and honest feedback without tearing us down. At the same time, we must also be mindful of our internal environment. Our inner dialogue, the way we speak to ourselves, plays a crucial role in our growth. Often, the most damaging voices are not the ones from the outside, but the ones in our own heads. We can be our harshest critics, doubting our abilities, second-guessing our decisions, and punishing ourselves for not being perfect. But growth is messy. It's not a straight line. It's full of setbacks, mistakes, and moments of doubt. Protecting the space for growth means cultivating self-compassion. It means treating ourselves with kindness and patience and allowing ourselves to be imperfect, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. Another crucial element of protecting the space for growth is embracing failure as part of the process. In a culture that celebrates success and achievement, failure is often seen as something to be avoided at all costs. But growth cannot happen without failure. Failure is not the opposite of success, it is a vital part of it. When we fail, we learn. We learn what doesn't work, what needs to be adjusted, and where we need to improve. Failure provides us with valuable information that we wouldn't have otherwise. But in order to benefit from failure, we need to create space where it's safe to fail, where we don't fear judgment or ridicule, where failure is seen as an opportunity for growth rather than a reflection of our worth. This means reframing our relationship with failure. Instead of seeing it as something to fear, we need to see it as a necessary step on the path to growth. Protecting the space for growth means giving ourselves permission to take risks, to try new things, and to fail without shame. It means recognizing that growth requires experimentation, and experimentation inevitably involves failure. If we are too afraid to fail, we will never push ourselves beyond our current limits, and our growth will stagnate. Another way to protect the space for growth is by managing our expectations. Growth is not always linear, and it doesn't always happen on our timeline. Sometimes we expect to see immediate results, and when we don't, we become frustrated, discouraged, or tempted to give up. But growth is often a slow, gradual process. It happens incrementally in small, often imperceptible steps. Sometimes it feels like nothing is changing, like we're stuck in the same place. But beneath the surface, growth is happening. It's like planting a seed. We may not see the roots spreading underground, but they are there, laying the foundation for the plant to eventually break through the soil. Protecting the space for growth means being patient with ourselves in the process. It means understanding that growth takes time, and it often happens in cycles. Sometimes we experience rapid periods of change, and other times we experience seasons of stillness. Both are necessary. The stillness is where we integrate the lessons we've learned, where we solidify the changes we've made, and where we prepare for the next phase of growth. In conclusion, true growth requires more than just ambition or effort. It demands intentionality, patience, and the courage to protect the space necessary for transformation. As we navigate a world filled with distractions, comparisons, and external expectations, it becomes crucial to carve out moments for reflection, to honor our unique path, and to nurture our inner resilience. Growth isn't about perfection or constant progress, but about learning, adapting, and becoming the fullest version of ourselves, free from the need for outside approval. By protecting this space, we give ourselves the greatest gift, the freedom to evolve on our own terms.